Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this final day of ENO's Transit Project Delivery Symposium. We're so excited to have you all joining us. My name is Brianne Eby. I am a Senior Policy Analyst at ENO and one of the co-authors of our report. And today's session is going to be taking a deeper dive into our Seattle case study. We chose Seattle's light rail system as one of our case studies for our report because it has significant portions of track that are elevated and tunneled, making it quite comparable in terms of complexity to other US and international projects. The region has also seen just rapid growth and a sizable capital program offering several unique insights into its capacity to manage, oversee, and deliver major projects. So the rapid growth of the system has also, though, brought challenges for staff capacity to deliver projects, as well as managing community requests for things like betterments, in addition to just raising costs in general. So we'll talk about some of those themes today with our panel. Before I get to introducing them, though, just a few housekeeping reminders. So there will be a half-hour break after this session. And then after the session that runs from 1:30 p.m. until 2:30 p.m. Eastern, there's an optional networking room that'll be available via Zoom. So that's just an opportunity to interact with panelists, the ENO staff, and other participants. So do join us there if you'd like to continue the conversation. All of the sessions today, so we do have some concurrent sessions digging into our other case studies, as well as the federal perspective. All of the sessions are recorded and posted, so you can go back and access those that you were unable to attend. And let's see, you can access all the sessions as well on the agenda tab to the left of your screen on Socio at any point. After we end this session today, you'll be prompted to rate and to evaluate this panel. Your feedback is so valuable to us, so please do take the time to offer comments and to rate each session. And just one final reminder, you can answer or ask questions at any point in the chat function through Socio. So please do that. Just as your questions come up, we'll have an audience Q&A at the end. But for now, I'll introduce our panelists. So we have Susan Fletcher, who is the Director of Operations and Program Management at FTA Region 10. Don Bellin, who's the Executive Director of Planning, Environment, and Project Development at Sound Transit. Finally, Claudia Balducci, who is the Council Chair for the King County Council. So in that order, so starting with Susan, I'll have each of you just first, I guess, describe your history and experience with transit project delivery in the Seattle region.
Good morning, and of course, there's a jackhammer next door, so hopefully you all can still hear me. Susan Fletcher, I have a bachelor's degree from Seattle University in civil engineering. Went to the Washington State Ferries as a marine engineer before going to the Federal Transit Administration in 2009, where I was a regional engineer on Sound Transit jobs since 2009. And since then, I've been promoted to the director, and just 2 weeks ago, I got promoted to be deputy regional administrator.
Congratulations.
Excellent. Don.
Good morning, everyone. Don Bellin, Executive Director of Planning, Environment, and Project Development at Sound Transit. I've been with the agency for 25 years. I started in September of 1996, and it was either going to be an opportunity to be in on the ground floor or a very short employment stint, because the agency was on the ballot that November, and if it had failed, regional transit probably would have been shelved for a very, very long period of time. But fortunately, it passed, and I've had the opportunity to be with the agency ever since and work in a variety of roles related to planning and capital project delivery. Currently, my department manages our system project and service planning, as well as our access, transit-oriented development, and sustainability programs.
Excellent. And finally, Councilmember Balducci.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Claudia Balducci. I am currently the chair of the King County Council, and I've been a board member at Sound Transit since 2010, although that's really hard to believe it's been that long. And I chair the System Expansion Committee at Sound Transit. But I think I'm probably most known in this zone for my role as a Bellevue City Council member and mayor. Bellevue is the city just across Lake Washington from Seattle to the east. And our East Link project that will cross Lake Washington and serve Bellevue and Redmond was featured in the ENO report as an example of a very challenging process and one that delayed the project by a number of years. So I fought the Battle of Eastlink, and I hope we get to talk about that a little bit today and some of the lessons learned there. Also, I guess I would say that more recently, I've been advocating as System Expansion Committee Chair for us to really take on the very issues that this report talks about and think in a big picture way about how we can accelerate delivery of our very ambitious light rail program. And I look forward to talking about that as well. Thank you.
Great, some excellent points that are teed up here, I think. So let's just dive right in. I'd like to start by talking about some of the early project origins. Specifically, I guess, funding. So what are some of the lessons learned from proposing large ballot initiatives to the public, and also some of the ongoing challenges with garnering public support for major projects? So I know there are, some challenges associated with making decisions now for projects that are, ultimately going to be delivered 10, 20 plus years down the line. I guess let's have maybe Councilmember Balducci start with that and talk through some of the ways that you're thinking about or have had challenges thinking about bringing large ballot initiatives to the public.
Yeah, there's a number of challenges there. I mean, starting right on the ground with talking to the public about why they should support the ballot measure when there's a lot of unknowns about what will actually appear in their communities. I think you can't overstate how important it is to remember that Sound Transit is a regional agency, not a Seattle agency. So we serve parts of three counties: Snohomish, King, and Pierce. Everett is the main city in Snohomish. Tacoma is the main city in Pierce. We've got Bellevue and East King County, and they all have very different views on mass transit and how it fits into their communities and serves their public and their economy. So walking down the street with a group of neighbors prior to ST2 and having to answer the question, how can I possibly vote for this package when I don't know where the stop is going to be? Like, well, you're not going to know that. So do you want light rail or don't you? And that's just like the public facing aspect. The planning aspect was very challenging as well. And I have to say, one of the things that I took away from, diving into the ENO report was this idea that governance is kind of destiny. Our governance structure really drives the size of our packages because we've got 3 counties, 5 sub areas, and we fund our projects by sub area. So if you need to invest a lot of money in Seattle to serve the next major destinations in Seattle, you have to raise a ton of money in other jurisdictions and serve and so balancing all that is very, very difficult. And I think the lesson to take away is how we find ways to build the discipline to be able to chunk out our projects in smaller chunks, deliver them with less turbulence and less uncertainty, and then retain the trust that if your project isn't in this chunk, it will be in a future one, and it won't be 40 years from now.
Mm.
And I'd like to invite the other panelists to chime in on this too. How are you thinking about funding? Susan, I know you mentioned difficulties kind of along the same lines about estimating a specific price tag. How does this come into play at the FTA level? Well,
as the FAST Act is getting ready to be changed, right? So we have these rules that will change every so often too, that can affect funding. So I think that's difficult. I mean, we can project, but we don't know what will happen there. I think when you're looking so far out too, right, there's so many, like real estate, how real estate has boomed in Seattle over the years, right, and is continuing to boom. And so I think there's certain rules about when you can acquire property versus where you are in the environmental process, and it's all a good process. But it does, have huge risks to the project, particularly when you have an area like Seattle and Bellevue that have grown substantially over the years with Amazon. So it's just been, it's really hard to project anything for 20 years, but more or less when you hit a boom like we're in now. So I think that makes it very difficult for projects to be able to truly know what the scope and the price of the projects are going to be because the area is changing so quickly.
Don, any thoughts from the agency's perspective on funding?
Yeah, well, I mean, Board Member Balducci's idea about how could we bite off smaller chunks at a time would be music to my ears. If you look at our 3 ballot measures, one in 96, one in 2008, and one in 2016, those are the 3 that have passed. They've gotten progressively longer in duration. So 96, it was intended to be a 10-year plan, 2008, a 15-year plan, and the most recent one, a 25-year plan. So, all of those issues that Susan was just speaking to of, how do you estimate what the cost of these projects is going to be over that long of a duration before you've done, any of the detailed planning and tackled all of the community issues that arise as you get into that more detailed planning. It's extremely challenging. And our enabling legislation requires us, as we go to the ballot, to estimate what's the cost of these projects going to be, what's the ridership going to be, and what's the timeline for delivery going to be. And then, we spend a lot of time sort of wrestling with the public about how come those projections aren't always accurate. If there were a way for us to do more planning, develop greater specificity about project definition before we had to go to the ballot for funding,
Yes.
I think that would just really put the entire region in a better place and make the delivery process less tumultuous.
Yeah. Can I add one thing? I think it's notable that when you look at this box of speakers, you see the big funding partners here. You see the FTA and the locals, and what you don't see is the state of Washington. And that is something that is notable about our state, how relatively small of a percentage of transit funding comes from the state, and that they could be a real player in helping us to figure out the stream and how we sort of bridge from one package to another if they wanted to really support this mode more than they do. And that is about state politics, which is another topic for discussion, but it's important here.
I'm curious too about, community engagement, environmental review process, that has all come up a little bit already in your comments. So I'm curious, specifically in the context of a changing region, what are some of the challenges with community engagement? How are you addressing maybe the challenges associated with, forecasting out for a long time period? So that, though, is compounded, as you've said already, by the fact that the region just is so dynamic, so different, and has different needs. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about engaging the community, given that there are so many different levels of, or so many interests, I guess I should say, at play? Maybe again, start with Councilmember Balducci.
Sure. This is where our region's well-earned reputation for process kind of comes into play, and it's not all bad, right? Like, community process is not a bad thing. Building up the level of community support that we ended up having in Bellevue for Eastlink over time was not a bad result. The challenge is that it takes so long to get there, and the level of consensus that we seem to require is so high, and that makes it very challenging. And as you see, it took years beyond what we had planned for. We definitely do have an expectation in our communities that they will be intimately involved in decision making that goes beyond reviewing a DEIS and giving input to it before we finish the FEIS, right? So what I would love to see is if we could find a way to integrate city planning and transit planning up front. We have a success story in Bellevue, in one part of the Bellevue alignment around that, and that is what we call the Bell Red area, cleverly named because it connects Bellevue to the next city over, Redmond. And the city, we had a planning director who saw this coming, saw light rail was coming, and that the most likely thing would be that it would head along 520 state route, because most of the alignment does run along freeways once you get outside of the core of Seattle. And he led us in a planning effort where we did a major rezone and upgrade to our land use planning through this formerly industrial commercial area to now have mixed use, affordable housing. We've got a new international university. I mean, like all kinds of things centered around the light rail stations that at the time we didn't know where they were going to be. We used the planning to drive the stations to a location. And that made it, that was the one segment of Eastlink where we had virtually no debate because the city and the agency had planned together in advance where it should go and why and what the land use theory was around it. It also helped that there weren't a lot of neighbors, like not a lot of single family neighborhoods in this commercial area. But that to me is a model for how we could think about planning in the future, how you bring that together so that when the time comes to select a preferred alternative, it's not a big push-pull that ends up with adding process and more studies and more process.
I can speak to that a little bit as well. You know, I mean, it was interesting for me listening to the panelist at the opening session sort of present the findings of the report and some of the recommendations. Many of the recommendations mirror almost identically conclusions that we came to in 2016 and 2017 as we prepared to implement the ST3 plan. We put together what we called our system expansion implementation plan. It was a lot of internal staff work, and then we did peer review with some of the same agencies that you did, you know, case studies on. And on the community engagement side, you know, sort of the consistent lesson learned was the importance of early engagement and trying to build that consensus. So we, you know, have put in place with our ST3 planning process a much more deliberate approach to that engagement at multiple levels: elected official level, community stakeholder level, and then interagency technical staff level. And the intent there is really to build that support, to narrow the range of alternatives before you go into the informal environmental review process. Now, the results have been mixed. Some projects we've been, you know, very successful in that. Other projects less so, though I would say even in our most complex project, there's a portion of the corridor where we were pretty successful in narrowing down alternatives. And I think despite controversial segments of the project, have built a lot of support for the core of the project. But, you know, the fundamental question, I think, does come back to the governance question. And, you know, at what point does the music stop and decisions get made to, you know, advance the project? And sort of the, you know, the holy grail in all of this is how do you have deep conversations that are sophisticated, nuanced, really getting to the core of people's interest, but then make a decision in a timely manner and move on. And it's the last part that we struggle with in this region, and, you know, based on your report, nationally. And here it's not just transit, it's on the highway side too. Our state DOT has a project that they've been working on to simply replace a highway corridor that has failing bridge structures. It's turning into a 30-year project, and it's a rebuild of an existing corridor. You know, we're trying to develop entirely new corridors, so this is tough work, and there's no silver bullets, but we got to focus on the decision-making part of the process, I think.
Yeah, and I'd love to, we'll eventually get to that. And I also want to hear Susan's take on the FTA's kind of involvement in coordinating between federal agencies for kind of the environmental review process. But before I do that, Dawn, you mentioned that the process to narrow down the range of alternatives has been successful in some places. and not in others. Any ideas why it is, what the potential success factors or challenges that are unique to different places are?
Well, I mean, one of them, Board Member Balducci touched on earlier. There's a definite correlation between whether you're impacting residential communities or not. You know, when you're impacting people's homes, it gets really personal, and it gets really hard. You know, objectively speaking, the relocation benefits that both federal and state government require are, you know, generous, I think, but no one wants to be told you're going to have to move for a project. So when we get into those areas, you know, we do wind up studying more alternatives, because, you know, people naturally have the question about, well, what if it, you know, went somewhere else? Technical complexities is another factor. And then just, you know, the extent to which we've been able to kind of build political consensus on how to move forward is the other big factor.
Can I add that we can't have this conversation in 2021 without talking about equity also. The way we serve and impact communities of color, communities who are more transit dependent, lower income communities is a notable issue. I think that there are some decisions that were made in Sound Move that we would make differently today, particularly a very long stretch of at-grade alignment that goes right through one of the most diverse, ethnically, racially diverse communities in all of Puget Sound. And that's caused issues, right? Like we have safety issues along that alignment. We have access issues in the way it breaks up one side of the community from the other by having the rail right down the middle. And so, but we have learned and we have worked more closely over the years with our communities, and particularly with representatives of groups that have been underrepresented, not as heard in, and that has resulted in some really good decisions, I think, particularly around how we site stations in places where we can really lift the community. But that is, I think, also a path to better planning. If we engage with those communities, underserved communities early, and work with them on ways that we can better lift their communities through our planning, that helps us when we get to things like the environmental process and permitting and local land use authority, because the community then sees the value, sees that benefit proposition, and it really helps for us to get through to the next stage of delivery and helps us to move faster. So I think there's a win-win in here, but we really have to focus in on the equity impacts and benefits of everything we're doing as an agency.
So starting, I guess, to pivot us into the conversation about governance, Susan, I'd love to get your thoughts on maybe specific to the environmental review process or any other coordination that has to happen between the FTA and other federal agencies, or between the FTA and state and local actors, although it sounds like the state is maybe less involved in this case. Can you speak to any of the challenges that are happening there? Any new ways that coordination is able to happen?
Yeah, well, I think, the Pacific Northwest has probably the most complicated NEPA process of anywhere in the country. So I don't think people really can wrap their head around how much detail and work goes into that evaluation. And I think just like, even Don was saying, a lot of the alignment is starting to run next to the freeway. And it's all about relationships, right? I mean, all of this is about relationship and getting timely, good information to people so they can make timely decisions, good educated decisions. And it's just very complicated. Running next to the highway, we had to build relationships with WashDOT and FHWA because we're working with them in a way we haven't worked with them before. And who has the authority to do what and who's really responsible for this. And, I think we're just all learning, and I think we're all building better relationships. And I mean, obviously we have we still have more to go on that, because I do think that, you know, some of these decisions we all feel like, why can't this decision be made sooner? And it's the same thing with construction. Everyone's like, that station's been up there. Like, why isn't it working? You know, and it's like, well, because you don't understand like what it takes to actually get one piece of wire to run 4 miles and work and do everything it's supposed to do. And so it just takes time. And I think there are certain things that it's very difficult to speed up. I think I think construction, you know, we're still finding some savings there, but I think we're looking outside of that now, right? Because I think a lot of the big savings, you know, we've already been adding additives to concrete to make it dry faster, but it still can only dry so fast. So I think finding ways that we can get decisions made sooner is the thing that's really going to help save a lot of time, but it takes a lot of relationship building. And I think that's what takes time, right? And then rules change, people change roles. And so I think it is interesting. I think each time a new alignment opens in this area, I think it's an easier sell with the public, because everyone is like, oh my goodness, look at this. I mean, it is so special to be part of this, because when you see the impact that this has on an area and people's lives, I mean, you can just really see it. It's astonishing to see the development and people out socializing at these cafes, and a lot of walkers, and it's really great. And I think a lot of times people are like, why does this take so long? And I will say that, you know, I think everyone would love to speed up the NEPA process. I think it is a really hard thing to tackle. So, you know, because you need to get the public input on the alternatives. The money that's being used to build these things is by the public for the public. So, and, you know, and as we know these days, it's really hard to get people to agree. So it's a really hard thing to tackle. And I think it's up to a lot of the leaders to be able to, you know, build those relationships, and hopefully, you know, we can get timely information to people so that they can make those decisions better, faster.
I'd love to continue on kind of this governance thread and drill that down to the more local level. Specifically for Claudia and Don, talking about the relationship between the transit agency and the board. So I know this came up in our conversation prior to today about, you know, just how the board has had a really big growing interest in, you know, expanding transit, and that's kind of allowed some of the visions to really take off. And there's a lot of ambition around this, but I think there's been kind of some maybe growing pains with that. Can you speak a little bit to that dynamic and what that looks like in terms of how the agency and the board really relate, and some of the processes and ways that you're growing along with those changes? Maybe, I don't know who'd like to start on this point.
I'll defer to my board member.
I was going to say, I think Don would probably not assuming anything, but yeah, I have to say that. So I've been on the board through the aftermath of the vote on ST2, planning for ST3, vote on ST3, and now beginning to implement ST3 projects. So from a line that was visualized to be about 27 miles of track that is now almost all laid, and to one that's going to be over 60. Like every one of our ballot measures, we have doubled the size of the system that existed prior. And so we've evolved through that exponential growth. In ST2 days, I would say the alignment issues were between the agency and the board on one side and the city on the other. And I had the interesting experience of sitting on both sides. So I actually was with the city. I was on the city council. I was the mayor at one point, and and I was on the board trying to bring us together. And we had very strong alignment through that entire process between the board and the agency. It was a really mutually supporting relationship. That's not to say everything was simple, but we worked hand in glove very, very closely, very intensely through that siting, planning, design, and ultimately construction process. What I've found recently in terms of alignment between the board and the agency is our program is now so complex, and there's so many different things happening all at once. There's so many different projects, individual projects, sub projects within them that are at all different points on the planning spectrum, from concept to ribbon cutting, right? And so that puts pressure on an agency. We've had to grow very quickly, and our processes have had to grow and change. And I think that's what you see happening here, is us working through the necessary evolution to become much bigger, much more complex. Oh, and by the way, we're shifting from being an agency that's mostly a building and construction agency to being one that more and more is a very large service agency, right? So that all plays out in this question of alignment. Where I see the discussion going now was very much on exhibit during what we called our realignment project that we just worked through. So at the beginning of COVID, like everybody, we projected a very steep drop in revenues. We weren't collecting fares, sales tax was off, which is our main source of revenue. And we projected a multi-billion-dollar deficit. And we almost immediately started thinking about, how do we continue to move projects? How do we responsibly vote on a big contract today, not knowing what that's going to do to the rest of the program in case we have a very large revenue shortfall? Ultimately, and this is another story, the revenue shortfall was disappeared through a combination of better knowledge about what was really going on with the economy and help from our federal partners. And so but then we saw this cost escalation that put us back in a similarly sized long-term budget hole. So here we are having this discussion about, how do we realign our entire program in order to make it affordable? That's our requirement. We must have an affordable plan. And there we started to have a debate. And I guess I would say that the debate looks a little bit like conservative responsibility, small c conservative, which is where I saw the staff and certain members of the board. We must plan something that absolutely can be delivered. We must be reliable. We must be responsible. And that looked like, let's just delay all the schedules, until that revenue line, fits. Raising my hand here, we're like, let's be more ambitious. We've got 3 legs to this school. We've got scope, we've got schedule, and we've got budget. And there are things we can do in all of those 3 legs to try to deliver the projects. In fact, let's bias towards schedule. Let's do what we can to make the schedules stick as much as possible, because they were already pretty long. So that was the kind of the debate that we were having. And what we ended up doing was merging these and creating a realignment plan that had the affordable schedules, along with a challenge to the agency, to ourselves, to try to meet more ambitious schedules by doing things around scope, schedule, and budget, and all of this planning, which we have yet to figure out how to do. We're going to stand up a board-initiated advisory committee of experts who are hopefully going to give us a real objective outside look at, how can we speed things up? Where do we have our blind spots that we're not seeing, where we could do better, faster? Where could the board stand up and provide that political leadership to get through some of this public process in a way that honors the public input and the public benefit, while also not continually going back to the drawing board, right? So I wouldn't say we're out of alignment. I would say we're having an internal growth process of, how do we manage the complexity of this huge program that we have in very dynamic and changing times, and come out the other side of it, hopefully stronger and better than we were going in. I don't know, Don, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would add is that I think pretty consistently the board has been visionary and pushed staff to do more. There's a famous quote from our former CEO, Joni Earl, that I believe when the board was saying, let's start planning for ST2, she said, shoot me now. Because, the agency was embroiled with just building the first line.
Right.
And, the board is hearing the demand from the public. The board is elected officials that are looking at the future of the community and the region and saying we need more. And so, that happened in 2008. It happened in 2016. And now, even with financial challenges, the board is saying, how do we hold this vision? It's so important that we still deliver. I totally respect that, even though it makes our task more challenging at times. We are lucky, frankly, when I look at many of my peers around the country, to be in a place where the appetite is so strong for what we're trying to accomplish.
I would love to know what was said when we said start planning for ST3 before we had delivered a single stick of ST2. Probably can't repeat it here.
Indeed.
So I'd love to transition. This is also something that's bubbled up a little bit, talking about staff capacity and the ability to deliver on some of the really ambitious plans that you all have. And I think I'll start with Susan on this one. You raised something, let's see, earlier. You mentioned people change roles. So a lot of the challenge, and we found this in our report too, a lot of the challenge with delivering projects is, especially on the public side of the spectrum, people that are on a project at one point may not be there by the time the next project rolls around. So can you talk about, I guess, go a little bit more into detail on what that looks like, and if there are any ways that you're thinking about addressing that?
Well, I think from the federal point of view, right, we always look at the management capability and capacity to deliver projects. And that's on every level, right? It comes from the agency level. It can be just within a certain department, right? I mean, if the right-of-way department doesn't have the capability and capacity, that can derail the whole project. So we look at it in each department as well as the agency. And it's something that's very hard because, we all know this has been a tremendous growth in our region for Sound Transit. They've grown tremendously over the years, really quickly. And like anything, you have growing pains. So I think, it's one thing that's great about the federal view is that with the use of our consultants, that we can go in there and sort of say, like, this is how this other agencies have done it. And we've been able to, I think Sound Transit's been able to deliver or to develop a relationship with LA Metro because they were just a couple of years ahead. And it's like, hey guys, how do you do this? How did you do this? And so I think that's part of it. And it goes back to one of the sessions yesterday. How do we make sure that the right people are in the right job at the right time? Obviously we can't do that all the time, but how do we make it better? And I think, it's something Sound Transit's looking into is like, is there a way to share staff between agencies? I mean, like, and FTA also does like a construction workshop, where everyone in the capital investment grant program gets together and shares lessons learned so that you can make connections. And I think, there are all these avenues like APTA and all these things that people can use, but it's time consuming, right? So it's like, you've got a job to do, which is to meet the budget and the schedule. So there are all these, constraints, making it really difficult on everyone to be able to do their job effectively and efficiently. And so I think that's one of the benefits of the PMOC program that FTA has, is that we can provide like that overview and help. But I think it's really tough when you look at the job market these days. The West Coast is building a ton. And it's really hard to say, hey, come move to Seattle where the housing prices are going through the roof. You might have work for the next 20 years, but you might not be able to afford a home to live in. So it is a really tough thing to grapple with. And I think, I think people are trying things. Um, you know, Sometimes it's a little too late, but I think everyone's really trying. And I think we're getting lessons learned, but I think people are working well together, and uh, I think there's just a great opportunity for people to be able to do things and learn new things. But it's, a lot of these things you don't want people to learn new things, right? You want them to already come experienced because these are big projects. But it is definitely something that we look at all the time. And we always encourage sound transit, right? It's like, okay, when are you going to fill these? And it's like, we're trying. So it's I'm not sure what some of the solution is there. You can't make people. So it's a difficult thing. And I think, the session was like, how do we start developing this industry more too? So it's, when you look at this, so when you look at your report even, right, it is all those things. That's a lot of work to work on all those things at once. So like, I'm not sure where the starting point is sometimes, because I feel like sometimes there's so much to do. Um, but yeah, so I think that's a tough one.
Yeah, Dawn, I love eventually your perspective from the agency on this staff capacity question. But Susan, you also mentioned Sound Transit looking at is there a way to share staff between agencies, and that's something that we talk about in our report, is sharing. Maybe that looks like sharing between two transit agencies. Maybe that looks like borrowing staff from the highway or the DOT side. Can you elaborate on what that looks like, and I guess at what stage in the process, like how developed is the pursuit of that type of program?
Is that directed to me or Don?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Susan, you brought up that point, but Don might also be able to answer that as well.
Yeah, I think that people are building relationships. I think Sound Transit is starting to look into that. So maybe Don knows more about that than we do, but I do think that they're trying to look into that. I know it's very complicated, but it would be interesting to know. I think it's really really complicated just because of pay scales and health insurance and like all the things. Like how do you share staff? And it would be great to have more of those interpersonal agreements between agencies, so that maybe you could, and then you grow the base so much more too. So, but I have no idea where that is. As far as in Sound Transit, I know we've talked about it, but I know that it's going to be a complicated endeavor.
Yeah, I think, the best example that we have of that is our partnership with the Washington State Department of Transportation, where over the years they have designed and built a number of our transit projects that have been in highway right-of-way. And we've got a bus rapid transit program in the I-405 corridor where, in fact, they are managing some of the design and construction. And we have successfully, I think, persuaded them to take on design of a station that's in the State Route 518 corridor using their I-405 program team. So that's maybe a little bit too inside baseball, but when we're building things in state, highway right-of-way that are direct access HOV ramps, and other sort of very highway intensive work, it makes sense to use them. The other thing I'd raise in terms of staff capacity is it's not just the transit agencies, it's all the agencies that have to review and approve our projects. So we actually fund over 20 state DOT positions that are co-located at our offices because so much of our work is dependent upon state DOT approvals. We work with over 50 local jurisdictions in our district. And when we have big projects, we often wind up having to fund some level of staff just to move our projects through the permitting pipeline. The federal government, I think, is frankly struggling right now because of this total swing of the pendulum from, being very resource constrained to suddenly these huge COVID funding packages and an infrastructure bill coming. So, Susan's probably too diplomatic to raise it, but the local FTA office covers 4 states. They only have 18 staff. The volume of grants that they're having to process is, gone up, I don't know, 4-fold. And then, you see it with other agencies that have to issue environmental permits for us. So it's more than just the transit agency. It's sort of mobilizing all of the resources across all of these agencies that have to be in place to deliver.
So I'd love to, I guess, pivot in our remaining time, and I'll invite the audience to offer some questions too. We still have 10 minutes left, so if anybody has questions, please do pose those. I see Mike Lindblom has been providing some really helpful context, so thanks for that, Mike. I'd love to, though, pivot our conversation into talking about some, like what's next. What are some of the promising things that you all are seeing? We've talked about some of the challenges, and there have been a few hopeful glimmers, I think, and really nice, things to look forward to. But I'd love to get into some more detail on those. Let's see. I think it was Councilmember Balducci. I think you were mentioning the board-initiated advisory committee on, looking into speeding things up. So maybe let's start there. Can you talk about what the progress is in standing up that committee? What is the composition of that committee going to be? How are you seeing that as a potential solution?
Yeah, so it's a concept that we adopted into our realignment motion just last month, just a few weeks ago. And the idea was to bring in people who are both expert at delivering big projects, presumably transit projects, but I don't know that we need to limit ourselves to transit project expertise, and have them take these big concepts that you see in things like the report and also our own internal review that we have done with an external contractor, and turn those into concrete recommendations for ways that we can improve our practices and start to deliver faster. We're still just standing it up. I mean, we just, the chair just communicated out, the chair of our board just communicated out a subcommittee of board members who will work together in order to select those people and recommend them to the board. And I'll serve on that subcommittee. So we're processing the process, which I think maybe shows why we need this kind of advice. But so that is just being stood up now, which makes it actually this a very timely discussion, because we're open to input and what this looks like. But I'll tell you, I've already spoken to one gentleman who has been involved in some very big construction projects here, including some of our light rail extensions, including some of our sports stadiums, and said, Claudia, if it was the Olympics, we'd build it in 4 years. And so, like, if we had just won a bid for the Olympics, we would build all kinds of infrastructure in 4 years. It can be moved faster. So my hope is that we bring that kind of an attitude of it can be done if we just have the will to do it, and then find some very specific ways to advance that will. But it's still in the early stages.
What about John? What about from the agency's perspective? Any, I guess, new processes or new things to be hopeful for about delivering projects, maybe on a speedier timeline or lowering costs?
Well, the initiative that the agency has put into place is to create a new portfolio services office where we're consolidating a lot of our project tracking and reporting functions, and that office is gonna support the board in putting in place this technical advisory committee. And, so we're frankly, I'll be candid, hoping they'll say some things that maybe staff can't always say. So we're interested in what their recommendations are as well.
Let's see. And Susan, anything on the federal side that you're seeing, especially right with the new administration, any kind of new approaches at the federal level that you think might be helpful for transit project delivery?
Well, I think that we see this administration trying to push the biggest infrastructure bill we've ever had. So I think with that, we don't have any clear direction yet because it's not passed yet on what that will mean. I think it would be fair to say they're going to want to see the money go out and be spent quickly. So I think it'll be interesting to see like what comes out of the new infrastructure bill and whatever replaces the FAST Act. I think we have to wait and see what that says. But we all hope that it would speed things up. So yeah, I think that we just have to wait and see what it says.
Susan, one thing we're hoping that federal funding is going to help with is that TOD pilot grant that we got, which we're using to work with the cities along the Everett Link corridor to develop a model code. If we could have more consistent code where we don't have to, with every jurisdiction that we go into, negotiate what the code is going to be for permitting these projects, that would go a long way as well. So appreciate that funding.
Beyond funding, and I guess in particular federal funding, what are some resources that would be helpful to deliver on some of the pressing needs that, from at the local level, from your all perspective, what's still needed in addition to funding, which is crucial? Whoever, maybe Dawn at the local level, what is there still a need for in terms of resources?
I don't know that resources are the main challenge, to be candid. It is a challenge, but one of the statements, I can't remember who from made it in the opening panel session was, time is money, and that is absolutely true. So yes, there are some funding constraints that are impacting us now, but honestly, the bigger impact, I think, is really this efficiency around how we get to decisions that are durable and that stick. So I think we need to concentrate our effort there. And I hope that will keep looking at that issue and dig deeper into some of the questions that you raised in your initial report.
Yeah. I'll just say, I don't think I can stress enough how much of a difference it makes when we have a local vision that aligns with the transit project coming into a community. When that happens, when the community and their local government gets ahead and plans and says, this is what we want, this is what works for us, it's just much faster because we don't have to go through as many outbursts of opposition, as many different requests for studies and more public process. And so I think about the challenge we have ahead of us in our international district, Chinatown area. This is a historic part of Seattle that has lived through all of the big, historical challenges of an immigrant community that you can imagine in the Western United States, from early, sort of laws and overt discrimination through, internment, and like you could just sort of, it is a historic location. And now here we come the latest in a long line of governments to come and want to build something very big and very impactful through the heart of this community. Wouldn't it have been amazing to have had a planning process with the community, with the city, and with the agency before we were faced with, do I put the line here or here? Do I put it underground, and how deep? Because then we could have done something that was maybe perceived as a big benefit to the community, as opposed to the focus on impacts, which is where things go when there's not as much advanced planning. I mean, COVID kind of laid waste to a lot of great plans in this regard, so I don't want to be overly critical, but that sort of thing where you can get the community around an alignment and a station area behind seeing the benefit to their community and advocating for something would just help us, because we don't have the land use authority in these areas. We don't have the permitting authority. So kind of pre-greasing that and making it into something that is seen as a net add would just be fantastic. And I'd love to work together with local government to find ways to do that.
And Susan, any final thoughts on, I guess, just additional resources we've talked about, kind of, coordinating at the federal level and some of the new administration's efforts on this front, but any, I guess, additional thoughts on what would resources, both, hard resources like financial contributions or other resources, but what do you think would be helpful here?
I think that we're being creative with Sound Transit. I think the way that we fund positions, sort of like Don was alluding to, they pay for positions at Sound Transit. They have positions in our office that they fund. So I think we're being creative there. I think, again, some of the growing pains of everything, and there probably be some more coming, is it's hard to get in front of some of those because we don't know what they are yet. I mean, I think that everyone is really, particularly in the Seattle area, like we said earlier, like all these cities or in little towns are just seeing like the benefit that comes with these alignments coming through, and everyone wants to stop. No one wants to lose their house, and we get that, but everyone wants to stop now because they see like what it brings to their community. And so I think like that is one of the big things with the infrastructure bill, right? Is like, what this does for the people. It's amazing. And I think it is hard. I think we need to get better on the front end about coming to conclusions sooner and being able to keep them like Don and Claudia are talking about, all the way through construction, all the way to be able to get our permits and get the thing operating. So I think that's something that we still need to do better on and figure out a way to be able to get the decisions made sooner, hold them, and work together. Everyone is in this to benefit. And sometimes we spend, a lot of money trying to answer questions or trying to figure this out or that, where if we could just really be really reasonable with the scope and the budget of the project and know these things ahead of time so that it can already be in the scope of work and we don't have to change it later, some requirement for a permit, and really mess up schedules and budgets. I think it would be really helpful if those things could be lined out sooner and held to all the way through.
Well, with that, we are at the top of the hour. So thank you so much to our panel. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. Just a reminder, we will have a half-hour break right now, but we'll reconvene at the half hour, and we'll be forecasting some of our future work on this. So more to come on this topic from Eno, certainly, and we really valued having your all's perspective and participation as a case study in our report, and we look forward to adding on to those findings. So we'll be talking about that in just a half hour, and then again we'll have a networking session at, let's see, I think that's at 2:30 Eastern. So please do tune into that if you're interested, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.